Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture on Genesis chapter 1 and chapters 4 to 11. Let's start by taking a look at Genesis chapter 1. This chapter, as you know from watching our video on the documentary hypothesis, stems from the P source, and that tells us several things about the context and the date of composition of this chapter. First, in terms of history, we're talking about a context in the exile. That is, most biblical scholars think that the P source was composed or edited together during the Babylonian exile, which would have begun with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 587 and was concluded when Cyrus the Great, the ruler of the Persian Empire, issued an edict allowing whoever wanted to return home to do so, and that would be in 539 BCE. This would have been a very, very difficult period for most of the Israelites. The exile, as we'll see in later sessions in our class, caused a tremendous theological emergency among believers. That is, the Neo-Babylonian Empire destroyed not only Jerusalem, but also burned the first temple to the ground. This would have led to a number of important theological questions. Where is God? How are we to worship God now that our temple, the one place in which we could worship God, has been destroyed? How are we to understand our relationship and our covenant with God now that the land God had promised us in that covenant has been taken away from us? How are we, as voiced so poignantly in the Psalms, to worship God in a foreign land? So the P source has several important answers to those questions, and two of the most important are found in this chapter. First, the deity is omnipotent. God is all-powerful. The defeat at the hands of the Neo-Babylonian Empire would have necessarily raised questions about God's power and God's strength. So the portrait that we get of God in Genesis chapter 1 serves to reinforce the point that God is omnipotent. Secondly, God hasn't abandoned the Israelites. Just because the temple was destroyed and the Israelites were exiled from the land which God promised them doesn't mean that God is not still around and not still interested in maintaining and cultivating an ongoing relationship with the Israelites, as seen in Genesis chapter 1. It's always helpful to remember when we're attempting to understand ancient texts that their worldview is very different than our own. The image I've provided for you here is a pictorial representation of the cosmology present in Genesis chapter 1. This, in other words, is how the author of Genesis 1 understands what the earth looks like and how the earth is situated within the larger cosmic environment. Now, this is a pre-scientific understanding of cosmology. Put differently, the author of Genesis 1 and his audience don't have the advantage of a larger perspective on cosmology. We do, in our current context, living post-Enlightenment, post-Newtonian physics, and in the era of the Hubble telescope, we're able to understand what our Earth looks like from a distance, as well as the natural laws governing the universe. So, as I said, we need to keep in mind the great chasm between a pre-scientific, ancient understanding of what the world looks like and our own. Let's take a closer look at Genesis chapter 1 and ask three key questions. First of all, How should we translate Genesis 1, verse 1? This is one of the more famous biblical verses ever, and in the New Revised Standard English translation, it's rendered as, quote, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, dot, dot, dot." This is certainly an acceptable way to translate this verse, but it's not the only way. In Hebrew, the first word in Genesis 1:1 is bereshit. It's a participle. In English, it would be an ing word that indicates ongoing activity, running, eating, etc. So maybe a better, more literal way to translate this verse would be when God was creating, or as God was creating. The reason this is important is that creation in the Pentateuch or the Torah is an ongoing activity, one in which God is intimately involved. So we don't want to lose that sense that creation is an ongoing process. Second, let's ask a more difficult question here. We're told in Genesis 1, verse 3, that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. Just exactly what kind of light does God create in Genesis 1:3? This clearly isn't sunlight, because that hasn't been created yet. It's not the moon, because that hasn't been created yet either. Because the text of Genesis 1 doesn't seem interested in helping us answer this question, some scholars bring in other biblical texts to try and give us a broader understanding of what could be talked about here. One scholar points to Isaiah chapter 30, verse 26, and the book of Job, chapter 38, verses 19 to 20, as evidence that light can exist independent of the sun. Well, that's fine. We also have a more mystical interpretation that comes from Jewish tradition. In a collection of rabbinic interpretations on the book of Genesis called Genesis Rabbah, the rabbis there note that this light probably represents, quote, "the splendor of the divine presence." And in order to prove, or in order to proof text that interpretation, they point to Psalm 104, verse 2, which describes God as being, quote, "wrapped in a robe of light." So that's certainly an acceptable understanding of what's going on here, even if it is a more mystical, more theologically oriented interpretation. Now, a Christian reader probably has less difficulty understanding what light is created in chapter 1, verse 3. A Christian reader probably reads that verse and thinks immediately of the opening chapter of the Gospel of John, where we hear about the origin of the Word or the Logos of God, which is characterized as a light that shines in the darkness. So a Christian reader probably looks at Genesis 1:3 and sees what we would call a Christological connection. That is, a connection between the light created in chapter 1, verse 3 and the light that is talked about in the opening chapter of John. So, a connection between Genesis 1 and John 1. Again, a perfectly valid understanding of this question of what light is created in Genesis 1:3. Let's look at our third question about Genesis 1. What does it mean to say something is quote unquote good, and what does it mean when that judgment is absent? As you can see from the table I've given you here, there are several key phrases that get repeated in Genesis 1 again and again. One of those is, God saw that it was good. As you move your finger to the left of that image, you can see that this is repeated on almost every day. On the first day, God creates light, and it's good. On the second day, though, God creates the dome of the sky with water above and water below, but we're not specifically told that God thinks this is good. On the third day, we have land and earth and plants. Those are all fine. Heavenly bodies on the fourth day. That's good too. On the fifth day, birds and aquatic creatures. Those are great. On the sixth day, animals are created, and those are good. But then we hear about the creation of humanity. And we're not told specifically that the creation of humanity is good. All we hear is at the end of chapter 1, verse 31, where God sees everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. So we have a bit of a quandary here. What does it mean to say that the heavens are not good and that humans are not good? Food for thought. So let's ask a few more questions about Genesis chapter 1. First of all, what's so important about the blessing for fertility in chapter 1, verse 22 and verse 28? In chapter 1, verse 22, we hear God, after God creates all the creatures of the sea, tell them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea. So God wants lots of fish running around. Great. In chapter 1, verse 28, we also hear this blessing after the creation of humans. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. So what's so important about this issue of fertility that we hear this blessing not once, not twice, but 4 times within the first 9 chapters of Genesis? Why would fertility be so central to this ongoing creation that God is maintaining? One possible answer could be the emphasis on offspring in the covenant that God makes with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, 15, and 17. In that covenant, God promises Abraham 2 things. 1, lots of offspring, and 2, a whole bunch of land for those offspring to live. So perhaps the emphasis on fertility here in Genesis 1 represents the first instance of a persistent theme in the rest of the book of Genesis and really the rest of the Pentateuch. And speaking of the creation of humanity in chapter 1, verses 26 and following, we have a couple of questions we need to ask here as well. First, how are humans created in Genesis 1? In Genesis chapters 2 to 3, we also hear from the J source about the creation of humanity. But in those chapters, humanity is created through God shaping and molding earth and then breathing the breath of life into that earth. So how are humans created in Genesis 1? And what might that mode of creation say about the way in which the P source wants to portray God and the power of God? Secondly, we hear that humans are created in the image of God. What might that mean in the context of Genesis 1? The Hebrew word there is tzelem, and it means image or representation. So what does it mean that humans are created in the image of God? Likewise, what does it mean when God tells humans that they need to, quote, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth? Does this mean that humans can do whatever we want with nature and whatever we want with all of these animals? Many scholars would temper that judgment and say that the verb in Hebrew, radah, in chapter 1, verse 28, needs to be read in light of two other texts in chapter 1. First, in chapter 1, verse 16, we hear, God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. Well, scholars point out that just because God creates the sun and the moon, that doesn't mean that those two lights literally rule over day and night, but rather that they exercise God's purpose. Secondly, if you look in chapter 1, verse 29, we have, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. So the vegetarian requirement that God lays out in chapter 1, verse 29, also seems to limit the human dominion that we hear about in chapter 1, verse 28. Finally, it's important to note, again, that chapter 1 stems from the P source. And in this source, which clearly has a connection to the priestly class and their concern with ritual and the cult observance of holidays, that it's not the woman that is the pinnacle of creation, as we see in the J version of creation in Genesis chapters 2 to 3, but rather it's Sabbath. It's the day of rest that is the pinnacle of creation. At the very end of chapter 1, we're told there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Beginning in chapter 2, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. The central ritual observance of Judaism is the Sabbath. Once a week, everything stops. And this is the literal meaning of the verb Shabbat, from where we get our word Sabbath. It means to stop or to cease. This is how the priestly source ends their story. As we can see in the next slide, when we lay out the order of creation. Here we see clearly the 7-day structure of Genesis, with the pinnacle of that creation being rest on the seventh day. So let's switch gears from Genesis 1 and take a look at Genesis chapter 4. I've got 3 points I'd like to make here, and the first is, why is Abel's sacrifice preferable to Cain's? It'll be helpful if you take a look at Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 to 4, in order to figure out an answer. And this question is more significant than it might normally appear, because it raises the issue of God showing favor. That is, one would expect God to be pretty pleased with both sacrifices, but God's not. And it's arguably the withholding of divine approval for the sacrifice of Cain that leads to the first murder in the Pentateuch, the first fratricide in the Torah. Secondly, because of this murder, many interpreters begin to view Cain as not just evil from birth, but the paradigm of evil. Now, this line of interpretation stems from a philosophical issue on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that the text in Genesis 4, many interpreters feel, doesn't adequately account for the viciousness and the theological importance of the first murder in biblical literature. The philosophical question, on the other hand, has to do with the character of God. That is, if God is omniscient, if God knows everything, and God is omnipotent, God can do anything, then surely God would have been able to have foreseen and prevented the murder. But if Cain is a personification of evil as some kind of cosmic force, then perhaps this goes a long way to explaining why God wasn't able to do that. If God is somehow stymied by the presence of evil. I'm also interested in the afterlife of Cain, because if Cain is the paradigm of everything that's evil, we would expect there to be some kind of follow-up on that. And indeed, we're rewarded. For example, if you look at lines 104 through 114 of the epic poem Beowulf, Grendel, arguably the first monster in the Western literary imagination, is said to be a descendant of Cain. And you should really take a look at Beowulf if you haven't. It's fantastic. But Grendel and his mother, two of the three monsters we encounter in Beowulf, are directly in the line of Cain, which goes a long way in terms of explaining the evil that they do in the poem. Third and finally, it's not immediately obvious in English what's going on in chapter 4, verse 10. But I want to use that verse as an example of how interpretations take on a life of their own. So if you look in chapter 4, verse 10, we hear, "And the Lord said, 'What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground.'" Now, in English, the word blood appears to be singular. But in Hebrew, that word is grammatically plural. But it doesn't make sense to have it that way. Your brother's bloods are crying out to me from the ground? No, that doesn't make sense. So, in order to deal with that issue, in order to answer that question of why would we have a plural word here when it seems to be requiring a singular, some Jewish interpreters look at that verse and assume that, first of all, there are no mistakes in biblical literature. If it's there, it must be there for a reason. And secondly, supply that reason through an application of ethics. So in a collection of Jewish interpretation called the Mishnah, we have a chapter therein called Sanhedrin. And if we look at the 4th section and the 5th verse of that section, this is what we hear. "We have found it with Cain that slew his brother. For it's written, 'The bloods of thy brother cry.' It doesn't say the blood of thy brother, but the bloods of thy brother, his blood and the blood of his posterity." They continue with the moral application of that grammatical observation and write, "If any man has caused a single soul to perish from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had caused a whole world to perish. And if any man saves alive a single soul from Israel, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had saved alive a whole world." Do you see the point they're making? It's not singular, it's plural. It must have been written as a plural on purpose for a reason. And the reason is to provide practitioners of Judaism with the ethical admonition that bloods means, as they write, his blood and the blood of his posterity. So if you kill a person, as Cain did to Abel, you kill not only them, you kill every person that would have issued from their line. And likewise, if you save someone from death, you save not just them, but every person that will issue from their line in the future. So this is just one isolated example of how close attention to a text can often yield surprising interpretive results. Let's take a look at the flood narrative that we have in Genesis 6 through 9. And I have several points I'd like to make here. The first of which is, in these chapters, we have two sources that have been combined, sometimes elegantly, sometimes clumsily. So the two sources we have are the J source and the P source, and I've given you on this slide the traditional and accepted division of Genesis 6 through 9 broken down by source. And what I'd like to do is take a closer look at how these sources compare. Here I've broken down some of the different characteristics and emphases of the J source and the P source in Genesis chapters 6 to 9. So you can pause the video here and take a look at some of these different concerns, some of these different issues, and note that while some of these may seem minor, for example, J says everything dies, but P says everything expired, some of these seem kind of major. For example, in J, there are 7 pairs of clean animals and only 1 pair of unclean animals, whereas in P, there are 1 pair of each animals. Similarly, in J, the flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights, but in the P story, the flood lasts an entire year. So why don't you pause the video for a second, take a look at these differences, and see if you can find any more. Let's ask a few more questions about Genesis 6 to 9 because, as we've seen, these chapters are a bit confusing. First of all, why is it that Noah was chosen for such an important task? The biblical text seems spectacularly disinterested in addressing that question. Secondly, I want you to pay close attention to the covenant with Noah, or the Noachic covenant that we find in chapter 9, verses 1 to 17. And there are a couple of important points here. First of all, we find the 2 final blessings for fertility in the first 9 chapters of Genesis, in 9:1 and again in 9:7. Be fruitful and multiply. Secondly, the vegetarian requirement for humanity that we heard in Genesis 1 has now been rescinded in chapter 9, verses 3 to 4. So Noah and anyone else who survived the flood can have a nice juicy steak if they so desire. Finally, pay close attention to chapter 9, verses 9 to 12, because this is the real heart of the Noachic covenant. And as we will see when we look at later covenants, it's these verses that differentiate the Noachic covenant from those we get later on. Because the Noachic covenant is not made specifically with humans, it's made with virtually all of creation, and it's not time-bound. Rather, it's eternal. So some theologians refer to the Noachic covenant as being a universal covenant. So it's important for you to keep this covenant in mind for when we see other covenants later on. Now, it might be a little jarring after the lofty theological language in chapter 9, verses 1 to 17, to come to the section of verses 18 to 27. So I want to make sure that you've read that first, and then let's try and answer these 4 questions. First of all, why is Noah drunk? Second, what does Ham do so wrong? Third, why curse Canaan and not Ham? And finally, how does this story impact understandings of race? Let me give you a little hint with that last one. Beginning in the 15th century, this text is used to support racial servitude because of Ham's supposed blackness. So if you look in chapter 9, verse 25, we get, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. And it doesn't take long to look at chapter 10, verse 6, and hear that the descendants of Ham are Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Now, these are all African areas. So, one of the key legacies of this text is its impact upon race. So I hope you all have found this mini lecture interesting, and I look forward to our discussion.